So this content is the result of that reconsideration that I promised to Helvidius Priscus and everybody in the law of self-defense community. Now, for purposes of clarity, the Texas burglary statute, which is section 30.02, Penal Code 30.02, and again, you can find that at lawofselfdefense.com/3002. There's 3 different paths to a perfected act of burglary, and I'm going to reduce each of these down to the elements that are only relevant for this event. So the first path is 30.02A1, and that refers to a person entering a building or any part of a building not then open to the public for the purpose of committing a theft. Now, Evans clearly entered the gun store for the purpose of committing a theft. I think that's the only reasonable interpretation of the video. And he entered certain parts of the building. For example, he went behind the counter, from which the public is generally excluded. So I would argue that's not, behind the counter is not open to the public. The store, however, was generally open to the public. So I would argue that here, this paragraph A1 would not apply to these facts. The second path to get to burglary refers to someone who hides themselves in a building, remains concealed in a building after it closes, not relevant here. The third path and final path under Texas Penal Code 3002 to get to burglary is paragraph A3. It refers to someone who enters a building to commit a theft. And this Evans certainly did. So this would be the only one of the 3 paths to burglary that would seem consistent with Evans' conduct as shown in the video. However, and this is the point of the tweet I received, all 3 of those paths, including A3, has as an overarching requirement that the person accused of the burglary entered the property without the effective consent of the property owner. If they had effective consent, it can have been burglary. The question then becomes, did Evans have effective consent of the property owner to enter the gun store? If so, Evans' conduct cannot qualify as burglary under 3002, even paragraph A3. And if it doesn't qualify as burglary, we've lost that justification under 9.42, defensive deadly force and defensive property under Texas law. So it's worth pointing out that without the effective consent is a more subtle term of art than you might expect. So, for example, it means more than merely without consent. The Texas appellate courts have held that uninformed consent based on fraud, for example, has been held to qualify not as effective consent. And I have a couple cases here. It doesn't change my change of opinion in this case, but just to provide context. Couple cases to share with you. So in the case of Acker versus State, that's a 2004 appellate court decision, the defendants there were charged with burglary under this portion of the burglary statute, 3002A3, and they had obtained consent to enter the building. So the property owner said, yeah, sure, come on in. Is that effective consent? Well, they obtained consent to enter the building under the false claim that they'd been sent to inspect for roof leaks. So based on this ruse, the building owners consented to their entry, but this was deemed to not qualify as effective consent, and those defendants' burglary convictions were upheld on appeal. Now, having said that, Acker is arguably distinguishable from this event with Evans because Acker involved a personal dwelling, someone's home, and not a business generally open to the public as this gun store was. In a case involving a commercial building, so more applicable to these facts, that's Pollard v. State. That's another Texas appellate court decision, this one from 1996. The defendant there was granted consent to enter a warehouse, so a commercial building, to access a water fountain, but he was not granted consent to enter the particular conference room from which he stole a VCR. So he was given permission to enter the building, but not the particular room. His conviction for burglary was upheld. Now, Pollard is also arguably distinguishable from this event with Evans because although the warehouse was a commercial building, it was not generally open to the public like this gun store was. A more applicable appellate court decision to this particular event can be found in Byrd v. State, another appellate court decision in Texas, this one from 1990, because Byrd involved a conviction under the same burglary paragraph we're looking at, 3002A3, the only burglary argument that could potentially be suited to this event. And Bird involved a business generally open to the public at the time, like this gun store. In Bird, the defendant's conviction for burglary under 3002A3 was reversed when the evidence supported the contention that the defendant presumptively had consent from the store to enter the store because the store was generally open for business. So the consent was implicit. And this was despite the fact the conviction was reversed, the burglary conviction was reversed, despite the fact that the defendant indisputably entered the store for the specific purpose of committing a crime of fraudulent theft. So he entered with fraud, he entered to commit a crime. Indeed, he'd been previously trespassed from the property for changing price tags on items. So he knew he wasn't supposed to be there in general. But nevertheless, his burglary conviction was reversed because when he entered the store, he had effective consent to enter a store that was generally open to the public. So the facts of Bird would appear most parallel to the facts of this case, making a burglary argument against Evans untenable. And absent a substantive argument that Evans was engaged in burglary, it would appear that at worst, Evans was engaged in theft. And theft is one of the enumerated crimes under which deadly force can be justified under Section 9.42, deadly force in defense of property. But for theft, the privilege to use deadly force exists only if the theft occurred during the nighttime. Here, Evans' theft occurred during the daytime, so it wouldn't qualify as a trigger for the privileged use of deadly force by Winger under Section 942. So absent any privilege for Winger to use deadly force against Evans under 942 for theft, Winger would need to demonstrate some other grounds to justify his use of deadly force. Now, of course, the more general justification for the use of deadly force would be in defense of persons. So forget the property crime, it's just in defense of persons. And that argument could be made if Winger can credibly argue that he had a reasonable perception, even if that perception was mistaken, that evidence was presenting as an imminent deadly force threat to either Winger or some other innocent person. So if Winger could argue, I reasonably perceived a gun in Evans' hand, for example, and I'm not saying that argument is credible, I'm just setting out the hypothetical, then he would be trying to argue that, well, I don't need property as a justification for my use of deadly force on Evans. I have life as a justification. There is another possible path for Section 9.42, deadly force in defense of property, to come back into play here as a justification for Winger shooting Evans. And that's if Winger can credibly argue that Evans was engaged not just in the act of burglary, which we've just agreed doesn't appear tenable here because Evans entered with the effective consent of the business open to the general public, but that Evans was actually engaged in a robbery, which doesn't have the effective consent condition. So robbery is another one of the enumerated crimes under Section 9.42, the deadly force in defense of property, that can justify the use of deadly force in defense of property. Now, what is robbery? Well, under Texas Penal Code 29.02, a robbery occurs when a person, in the course of committing theft with intent to maintain control of the stolen property, intentionally or knowingly threatens or places another in fear of imminent bodily injury. Now, note, it doesn't say imminent serious bodily injury, just imminent bodily injury, really any injury. So this is different than the defense of persons argument that would have to be made. If Winger wants to argue, I shot Evans in defense of persons, either myself or some other person, for his use of deadly force to be justified, he'd have to show that Evans was presenting as a deadly force threat, death or serious bodily injury. But if he's going to claim his justification was robbery under Section 9.42, robbery only requires some bodily injury, not deadly force bodily injury, not death or serious bodily injury. Any degree of bodily injury would be sufficient to arguably support a claim of robbery, and robbery would be sufficient to support a justification for deadly force under 9.42. That said, Winger would have to convince a jury, well, the state would have to be able to disprove to a jury that Winger had a reasonable perception that that Winger was in fear of some bodily injury, or Winger was in fear some other person would suffer bodily injury by Evans, as Evans was attempting to maintain control of the property. So, for example, if Evans was threatening anybody with any degree of force in his escape with the stolen money, that would be sufficient to support robbery. And robbery would be sufficient to support deadly force under 942. Does that exist here in the video? I don't think I see that. If Evans was even going to say, bowl someone over, shove someone out of the way forcibly to escape out with the money, I could see a robbery argument. But I'd need to hear some burden of production from Winger to support that argument. So whether either defensive persons or the robbery argument would be reasonably adequate to provide a justification for Winger shooting death of Evans, it's certainly a discussion that can be entertained. My initial sense is that the video alone would support neither of those arguments. But this could change depending on additional facts, particularly depending on statements by Winger. That discussion, though, whether defensive persons or a foundation of robbery would support Winger shooting of Evans, is not the purpose of today's show. That would be a different show if we ever get there. Today, I'm only addressing the question of whether the burglary argument that I made yesterday would be reasonably adequate to provide that justification for Winger shooting death of Evans. Yesterday, I argued that it would. Today, at the prompting tweet of Helvidius Piscus, I'm obliged to reverse that opinion. Now, in appreciation to Helvidius Piscus for offering a reasoned argument for me to reconsider my position of yesterday, I'm going to be offering him an autographed hard copy of my book, hardcover copy of my book, Get Hard, The Law of Self-Defense, and of course, that's for free. I'll contact him if he wants to provide me with a mailing address, and I hope he does. I'm happy to send him out an autographed copy of the hardcover of my book. For those of you who offered emotional reasons or other bad reasons for me to change my mind, no prize for you. That's not reasoned argument arriving at a better reasoned position. That's just dumb luck. So dumb luck doesn't get rewarded here at Law of Self-Defense. Reasoned argument gets rewarded. Dumb luck doesn't. So better luck next time for all of you.